We are concerned not merely with the technical problem of securing and maintaining peace, but also with the important task of education and enlightenment.
Grant, you got another new book coming out?
Yeah.
Wilbert Smith, one of my favorite stories. Tell me about Wilbert Smith, Grant.
Okay, well this is the basically the story of the Canadian government. So to give you the background,
The Canadian government involved in UFOs.
well they were called flying saucers. So Wilbert Smith never really used the word UFO. So what you got to remember with this UFO thing is that a lot of this is playing games. So 1952 is when they discovered, when they made the term UFO. It was by Ruppelt, who was the head of the U.S. Air Force Blue Book. And so they changed it because they didn't want people saying flying saucer and flying disc because that implies what's going on. So they said, well, we'll call it UFOs, and that's where it came from. So Wilbur never really used the term. He always called them flying saucers, flying discs. So
what year was that? When this?
He started in 1950.
1950,
In November
right.
of 1950, he writes the famous what's called the Top Secret Memo. But let me give you the background how I got involved with this, because I didn't know he existed or whatever. So I have my sightings in Manitoba in 75, 77, beginning of 76, mid 76. And I'm working at this, and I said, oh man, this is the biggest story ever, man. This is going to be like million-seller book. And I go and get this book already, and I go to Toronto, and I send it to people, and I get the outline of the book, and send in the chapters like to the actual publishing companies. And one company in Toronto read the review, but I put it in front of their board, and they said, nah, we're not really interested. So I went to the Winnipeg publisher, who was a big publisher here, and I said, oh, she'll do this, because this is a big story in Winnipeg. Everybody knew about Charlie Red Star. It was a big thing. And she said, Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers. And I went, holy shit, I couldn't believe it. So I said, that's it for sightings, man. This is a total waste of time. So I parked the book. I gave it to my sister. For 25 years, my sister held the book, the Charlie Red Star, or the Charlie Red Star book, and then gave it back to me, and I hadn't even forgotten I'd even written the book. So anyway, I gave up on the sighting stuff, and then just before the sighting stuff ended, there's still a couple of sightings came in. My father worked for the Department of Transport. He was the Air Force, Canadian Air Force. Then he became a pilot in the Canadian government, so he was an aviation inspector. So he'd go to airports and inspect airports, and the guy that, you know, people coming in over buildings, how big can you build a building near the airport, and all this kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff. So he says he had a sighting in '76, which I reported to the National Enquirer. My father was never so angry in his life, and he got a phone call from the National Enquirer wanting to comment about his UFO sighting. And anyway, so he was kind of, you know, he liked to play the skeptic. He was, you know, not over, like, down the rabbit hole like me. But so he says, I was talking to Ernie Epp in the office today. He wants to talk to you. So this is a guy, he's a radar technician in my father's office in Winnipeg.
And you were already into UFOs at the time? Or
oh yeah, this is sort of when we'd done the Charlie Red Star stuff. And he said he had a UFO sighting. He wants to talk to you about it. And I said, oh, okay, cool. So I go to this guy's place, whatever. And he's a radar tech. And he was actually famous for, in 1959, a U-2 crashed in Canada. And it was rumored to be a UFO crash. And it happened on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border up north. So Ernie Epp was the guy who was watching the radar, and as the thing came over the poles, and they basically determined this was a U-2, and they could see it coming down. And so they said when they got there, the accident investigator guy was also in my father's office. He went up there, and this is in Paul Heller's book. Paul Heller writes his story.
Oh, yeah.
And so they go up there, and he said, we get to the site. He says, and there's these Marine guys, or these military guys with, you know, semi-automatic rifles standing there or whatever. And he says, from the Canadian government, we're going to investigate this crash. And he says, no, sir, you need to leave, sir. He says, I'm the investigator here. You're on Canadian territory here. And he says, the guy sticks the gun in his stomach and says, sir, the African-American guy, sir, I advise you to turn around and leave. So he's like, this is 1959, he doesn't know what the hell to do. So he's all upset. He goes and gets on the phone. He phones Ottawa and he says, "Hey, there's something's crashed here on the border here, and I'm here to investigate. And these damn Americans are there, and they're telling me I can't go on the site." He says, "What the hell's going on here? This is our country." And the guy says, "Hang on." Well, it says 30 minutes later, I phoned him back and said, "You better let the Americans do what they want." So Ernie F was involved in this case. So he says this sighting. It was just a UFO sighting, some light in the sky. But I think it was related to Carmen or whatever. But he's telling me this sighting, and then so he tells me the sighting, and it's like, oh, okay, whatever. And then he says to me, he says, "You know, if you want to know what's going on with UFOs, you should study Wilbert Smith." And I said, "Well, who's he?" He said, "Well, he's the guy who ran the Canadian government UFO program. I used to work for him."
What?
I said,
Really?
"You did?"
Oh, neat.
This is one of these synchronicity things. I said, "You work for the guy?" He said, "Yeah." He said he was the smartest guy I ever met in my life. He was the smartest engineer I ever met. He was totally crazy. He said, "He was totally crazy, man. He had the UFOs were landing in his backyard. He was talking to aliens." I go, "Is what?" I go, "What? Really?" And I said, "Holy shit!" So then I track it down and get his.
What year was this? You think? Do you remember what year it was when you were talking to this guy?
It would be 76. No, it'd be 76 or 77.
Wow.
So it was like that period when they would publish the book in 77. I think they wouldn't publish the book. So then I figured, okay, I've tracked down this. I found out he was dead. He died in 62, Wilbert Smith. But his wife was still alive. And her name was Merle Smith. So I contact her. I contact her by surface mail. And I said, "Oh, I'd like to come to Ottawa, and I'd like to interview you and talk about what your husband's doing." And she said, "Oh yeah, come, yeah, fantastic." So she was so amazed that this young guy in the 70s would fly across Canada to come and interview her. So I go there, and I remember I get in the car, I got to rent a car, and I pick her up, and she says, "Oh, we're going to James's house," or the oldest son's name. They had 3 kids. 2 of them had nothing to do with UFOs. I never met them. I never heard them comment on UFOs. The one kid, the oldest kid's name was James, and he was the kid that hid the files and stuff when it was all over. And so we're going to James's house. I still remember we're driving to James's house, and she's talking about Alpha this, Alpha that, and it's like we're talking to Alpha, and going, it's like she's talking about the family pet or something. This is so weird. And we get to James's house, and then we talked about different stuff, and she started telling these really bizarre stories. And one of the stories like, for example, it's in the book. I give the one story is Paul Hellyer tells this famous story. He gives this lecture at St. Paul, Alberta. So the 100th anniversary of Canada was the centennial. And they had all these centennial projects all over the place and this and that, whatever. So St. Paul, Alberta builds a landing base for a tourist attraction. So Paul Hellyer goes there, and he's defense minister at the time, and he gives this speech. And it's on the front page of the Toronto paper, Ottawa paper, Winnipeg paper. And the Winnipeg paper says, "Top secret project strikes out. July the 1st, 1967. So I go, and I'm thinking, this has got to be, and he said, "This isn't the first time we've had a UFO landing base. We had one in 1954 at Suffield, Alberta." So Suffield, Alberta was the army base where they were doing nerve gas tests, and they actually blew up a city there. They had this thing where they had these dummies or whatever, and they had these trenches, and these guys were in the trenches, and they blew this town up with the dynamite or whatever, and they had the fallout, and these guys were in the trenches, and what the fallout was and all this kind of stuff. And they were doing all these weird stuff, and my father told me it had a no-fly zone over top of it, just like Area 51, same thing. So anyway, he said that they had opened the base. So in the 70s already, there was a guy, Arthur Bray, was a researcher in Ottawa. He and I were sending letters to Paul Hellyer already in the 1970s. And the question was, so how did the UFOs know where to land? Like, I mean, what's the deal? I mean, you open the base, but the UFOs have to know how to land. So I'm thinking, well, maybe it is Wilbert Smith. So I bring this article to Mrs. Smith. And she was telling me all this stuff about the Prime Minister, that Wilbur had taken it to the Prime Minister of Canada, and that the Project Magnet report, which is the Department of Transport report. So there's 2. One was Department of Transport, one was Defense Department. So the first Project Magnet report, and they had a second one. The first one sat on the Prime Minister's desk for 3 months. And then they decided, the President, was Laurier, Saint Laurent at the time, and that they decided it wasn't time to release it. She told me that, and then so I showed her this article, "Top Secret Project Strikes Out," talking about the base. I said, "Can you read this article?" And she says, "Yeah." I said, "Okay. Can you tell me whether Wilbur is involved in this?" And so she reads the article, and she goes, "Yeah, it was Wilbur." And I said, so what happened? And she said, well, he was in contact with AFA. And he said to the Canadian military, the high level, there was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, she said, were involved. The Prime Minister's cabinet was involved. And the military was involved. And so he said to them, he made this deal. He said, if you don't try to shoot the damn thing down, I'll get it to land. So they said, okay. So that's why they opened Suffield. So Suffield was open for AFA to land at Suffield.
So going back, so Wilbur Smith was channeling aliens or entities?
Well, I asked people around him. So what he wasn't really, he was getting messages. Like I asked the one guy, I said, how did Wilbur get the messages? Because I was trying to figure out, like, how did this happen? And he said, well, he really didn't get the messages. He would keep a pad by his bed at night. And then he would get up in the morning and there would all be this stuff written on the side of the pad. And they actually told about the one experiment, remind me about the experiment in the garage, but they would have these things where he'd come in and say, oh, AFA says this, AFA says that, and he was getting that. But the main contacts were, number one was Frances Swan, that's the big one. She was in Elliott, Maine, down the road from Frances Swan, she was a medium in Elliott, Maine. She was down the road from Betty Hill, who lived across the river in another state, but within about 2 or 3 miles.
Mhm.
And so she was the main channeler. She was the main one. I think there was about 5 people with AFA. There was a military guy. There was a guy who was a blind telex operator who was getting telegrams, which involved this experiment they were doing, where this blind telex operator would just phone up and he'd say, "Oh, there's a message from AFA," because they were doing this experiment in the garage, where Wilbur was being given this information on how to build. He called it gravity control, not a anti-gravity, but gravity control experiment, where he would have these things, and he had a lawnmower engine, no, not a lawnmower, a engine from a washing machine and a vacuum cleaner. He had these linked together and all these belts, and they were rotating this plate at 17,000 revs a minute. And they had these plates, they had these magnets.
Kind of like a perpetual motion machine or something like that.
Well, what they were trying to do is they would measure it, and then it would be 2% less weight,
Right.
which showed it was getting a levitation effect. And he'd been told how to do this. So what had happened was they were getting these messages. So that was one of the things where there was a radar. There was a military guy here in Manitoba that when I talked to Mrs. Smith, she said, "Oh, you got to talk to Art Bray." Now, Art Bray didn't want to talk to me at all. He said this thing ruined his life. He was an expert on metals, on Russian nose cones. He would talk about Russian nose cones, and they were analyzing how high it would go based upon the nose cone, what happened to the nose cone and stuff like that. And she said, "Oh, you got to talk to this guy. This young little guy. He came all the way to Ottawa. I want you to talk to him." And he lived in Morden, Manitoba, which is about 70 miles from here. So he told me the story. He said they were working on this gravity control thing in the garage, and then Wilbur comes in and he says, we got a message from AFA, do this, whatever. And all of a sudden the phone rings, and this blind telex operator is on the phone. And he said, "I got a message from AFA." He said, "Shield the experiment." And Wilbur actually, in some of his writings, actually talks about this. He said, "Okay, that's it, hold it." And he said, "No more." You build a wall made out of bricks inside the garage. They built this brick, and they turned on the machine, and as soon as it turned on the machine, it exploded. And there was ceramic magnets dug in the wall. And Wilbur actually says somebody would have been seriously injured. But that's how they were getting these communications. It was really weird how they're getting these communications. And anybody that Wilbur was talking to, so if he heard you were talking to an alien, he would investigate. He was the idea of talking to the experiencers. And he believed that there was all these people that had this alpha contact.
So at this point, someone who might not know about this would be asking, what is Wilbur's credentials? Was he just a crazy guy who just worked in the government, or from what I know, he had some pretty serious credentials. He's a pretty serious guy.
He had a master's degree in electrical engineering. He was the chief radio engineer for the Department of Transport, and now it's the Department of Communications. But I remember the whole deal was he had this high-level security clearance. I talked to the guy, the metallurgist, and he said, "Don't you know who Wilbur was?" I said, "Well, yeah, he was the head radio engineer for Department of Transport." "No, you don't know what he did?" And I said, "Well, no." He said, "He ran Radio Ottawa." And he said, "You know where that is?" I said, "No." And I've looked it up numerous times. I could never find it. He said, it's called Radio Ottawa. And what they had was the flying saucer. They had built a flying saucer thing to track UFOs, which had 5 different things: change in noise, change in gravitational field. They had all these things, and they had alarms. That's what this radar tech guy was working on.
Right.
He would change the tapes in these machines, and they were trying to get UFOs to fly over there and then pick it up. And so he said that was on Department of Defense property, on the Defense Research Board, which did all the weapon research. The same as Vannevar Bush in the United States was working on weapons there. These are the guys that worked on the weapons with the Americans and with the...
A lot of information online about this, the big radio towers they had in Ottawa.
The Shirley's Bay is what it's called.
Sure.
And so he was picking off Russian communications because he was in charge of all the channels, FM, AM, CI, all the people using all the different radio channels. Wilbert Smith had access. He was the guy. And when he was going to the United States, they were negotiating FM radio frequencies that had just come on at that time with the Americans. That's why he was in the United States. And that's when he was in the United States, he said, I asked some questions about UFOs, and people started to talk, and I realized where there's smoke, there's got to be fire. And that's when he really got interested. And he comes back to Canada after this 1950 meeting, and he has this meeting at the embassy with Robert Sarbacher, who was a big military advisor for the Americans at the time. And he gets told flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. A small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush are trying to figure out what's going on. The subject is of tremendous significance to the Americans, and the Americans have also told us, and he's saying American officials are telling me that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena.
That's right.
And so that's this famous top secret memo that he writes, and then at the end of the top secret memo, you'll see the deputy minister. So in Canada, the minister isn't the powerful guy because they shuffle the cabinet all the time. It's the deputy minister is the powerful guy. He's there all the time. So the deputy minister signs off. He says, "Okay, go ahead with it and keep me informed." So he actually gets the authorization. So people say, "Oh, he didn't have authorization. He was just
These
this crazy
documents
guy."
are in the book, right?
Yeah, these documents are in the book. So that's this whole thing, how it starts. I get there and I find out that this is all for real. And they had AFA was the main one. Then they had this PONAR, which Mrs. Smith didn't really talk too much about. But the other one I heard a lot about was this TILA. So TILA was, they called him the garbage collector. So Wilbur was big on nuclear weapons. Stop the nuclear weapons. He was being told by them, you got to shut the nuclear weapons down. This is bad news that you not only get the plume go up into the sky, you get the energy go down through the earth.
And this was in the 50s? He was
50s. Yeah. And he claimed that it was creating areas of reduced binding. So when the wave would go down through the earth, it would come out the other side of the earth and it would create these sections. And Wilbur Smith claimed these planes were crashing because they were going through these areas of reduced binding that were being created by these nuclear weapon stuff. And he actually said that it got put on the circular file. He tried to convince the Canadian government, and they just thought he was totally crazy and wouldn't listen to about and he had this binding machine that even his son told me to build. This thing that you could actually go to Toronto. They were saying, go to Toronto and you can get these areas of reduced binding and stuff. You can pick them up with this machine that Wilbur had built that the beings were telling him. So he was getting messages mostly through Mrs. Swan. Then he was also getting messages. This radar tech told me. He says to me, he says, well, I went to Shirley's Bay the one Sunday. He says, just to drive around with the wife or whatever. He says, oh, look, he says, the parking lot's full. He says, what's going on? It's Sunday afternoon. And he goes in there, and all these guys are around the big radio. They got this, I don't know what they use this radio for or whatever. And Wilbur's saying, make the communication. And the guy said, it's an illegal communication. I'm not making the communication. Wilbur says, make the communication. The guy said, I'm not making the communication. This is an illegal communication. I'm not going to make the communication. And what they were doing is they were radioing alpha. They had the guy actually told me what the frequency was. It was 9.4 something. I can't remember. If I had known I was be telling these stories years later, I would have remembered what the frequency was. But he said he knew what the frequency was. This was the weirdest thing in the world to walk in there. But he said this kind of stuff was going on. So I asked Mrs. Smith about this thing about the UFOs, talking to the aliens and UFOs landing in the backyard. And she said, well, yeah. And she explained it. And it was sort of like one of the stories that gets twisted. So what they had is now called orbs, which we called ground lights in the 1970s, which when I talked to this guy in Morden, this metallurgist guy, I said, hey, we're over in Carmen there in Spartan. We have these things on the ground there, and they sit there, and we flash lights at them, and they flash back, or whatever. He goes, oh, yeah, you mean monitors? I go, oh, yeah, monitors. I go, like, I play along like I know what's going on. He says, ah, yeah, we had those back in the 1950s. They're all over the place. And he said they would monitor the meetings, and they would sit on the windowsill. They'd have a UFO meeting, and they'd look, and the thing would be on the windowsill, sitting there listening. And so they called them monitors. And I said, I was talking to Mrs. Smith, and she said, oh yeah, these monitors were in the yard all the time. And she said that the one time they burned out a whole row of my beans. And then she said, and the one time they were, the neighbor's tree hangs over into their yard. And she says, they burned out the part of the tree. It was sitting in the tree, and it destroyed part of this tree. And she said, the neighbor came and said, Wilbert, we really don't care where your little friends are from, or what's going on here, but could you tell them to stay out of my tree? She told me this story. So you got this story, like the lighting in the back.
Absurd. That's really
It was true. It's like when you're hearing this woman, and she was herself, she was secretary to the Speaker of the Senate. She was no little.
Right,
but
right.
what had happened was, at that time, French was coming into Ottawa, where you had to speak French in order to get a government job. And she was just like, just not, we're not having any part of this, man. These damn French people. She had this thing about, and she said she was ready to talk. It was about 2 days before she retired that I talked to her.
Really?
And she was ready to talk. She told me all sorts of stuff that was going on. And unfortunately, I didn't tape it, or but I remember a lot of the stories she was telling me, and it was like being in Twilight Zone. She was just, oh yeah, we were talking to aliens.
Wow. So was there other people in the government that were with Smith that also were involved?
There was a lot, but they all held back. They never, they had the one we put at the very beginning of the book. We have a drawing that Wilbert has of a flying saucer. It has this little gun on top of the flying saucer. They're shooting a gun off this flying saucer. And it was a meeting that they had, and names all these different guys, and some high-level guys that were top scientists at the time, like Omar Salant. The one thing I think we had an interview before I referred to it. Omar Salant was the head military guy for building weapons in Canada. And he was a very religious guy. He was in Toronto. He's friends with Paul Heller and stuff like that. And so Omar Salant was mentioned in the top secret memo that he was sort of because it was a project. Magnet was a transport project, but it mentions Oman Salant in defense. So this is November of 1950. It gets approved December the 2nd, 1950. And then 6 months later, in Montreal, at a hotel in Montreal, MK Ultra starts. And Oman Salant is at that meeting. And Oman Salant is all about, and MK Ultra is all about mind control. So you have this 1950 memo 6 months before that's written about the fact that the Americans say mental phenomena is part of the UFO thing, when there's no contactees running around. Nobody knows aliens are telepathic. Nobody even knows there's aliens yet. The whole identity thing wouldn't start till 1952.
I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight, Grant. Shit.
And so Oman Salant is in this meeting. And that's where we say, like, man, this started the whole thing. That's what scares me about the technology, is what are they going to use it for? If they figure out the skinwalker stuff or whatever, what are they going to use it for? They're going to have little blue meanies coming to go after you and me and the Taliban, and it's just like, we're just going to use this for weapons, and that's the scary part. And so Wilbert even said at the end of his life, because he had this gravity control thing that he was working on, and his wife says to me, he says, he went to the government. She said he had 37 patents, 37 patents, and only got one through. They bought a car with it, and the government was furious. So he would build these radio communication devices for Department of Transport planes and stuff like that. He had all these inventions. And she said they would just come in the house, just walk down, take the equipment, walk out, said, you're working on government time, we own this.
Wow.
And so then one they slipped through, and she said the government was furious that they slipped this patent through, and they were able to buy a car for it. And, so then she said, so at the end of his life, he goes to a Dr. Rose. And I looked it up. There's this high-level guy in the National Research Council, Dr. Rose, who actually came to a couple of these meetings. And he goes to Rose and he says, I've got this gravity control thing. And we've reduced the gravity by 2% or something like that. And then Rose says, well, write it down. I said, no, I'm not writing it down. I said, no, you gotta write it down. We don't want to look at it unless you write it down. He said, no, if I write it down, you're going to walk in my house and take it, and I'm not writing it down. And he said, no, we will not look at it unless you write it down. And his wife says, Wilbert came home and said, she said, went into the garage, took the whole thing apart, came in and said, probably just going to build bombs with it anyway. It's better that we take it apart. And she said he never spoke about it again until he died. He only died a couple of years later. And she said he just disassembled the thing, and he even had the idea that this was not going very, very well in terms of what we're going to use this stuff for.
I think that was probably one of their main interests is weapon technology or advanced propulsion, you know, just like any government group, right?
Yeah, that's what's going on now. You see, it's in, I say now, I mean, you have this whole process, what people call disclosure. It's in front of armed services and in front of intelligence. It's not in front of the, you know, the aerospace committee, it's not in front of the science committee, it's in front of armed services and intelligence, which is all the weapons. And people will say, oh no, in the background there may be, or whatever. It's like, well, I haven't heard it yet. I mean, I'll cheer if there is, but so far I know there's nobody else is involved. And I even wrote an FOA to the Biden administration, to the Office of the Science Advisor, because that's where Podesta wanted to put, because that's the science advisor to the president that look at the UFO thing. So I actually filed an FOA because they can't withhold FOIA, they have to answer right away, and said, what do you got on UFOs? So I'm going to see, is the White House involved in UFO
Well,
research?
you didn't get anything back from
I
that?
haven't got it back yet, so it may take a while, but that will establish if there's nothing in that office, then they ain't doing any science stuff, it's going to be just straight weapon stuff, which is, you know, what they, and that's the way it worked. People don't realize that, like before World War II, you had guys like Schrodinger and Einstein and Max Planck and all these guys who were working on all these different inventions, and they said consciousness is primary, and they made all these real dramatic statements, and they're trying to figure out how the universe works and making these discoveries. As soon as World War II came along, then it all changed to this exploitation thing. Instead of exploration, it became exploitation to develop weapons. And after World War II, it was always to do with weapons. So because you invented nylon and plastic explosives and jet engines and all this stuff during World War II, then it was like, we'll develop it with the weapons and then we'll spin it out, like we did with the internet or with GPS. That was all military stuff. And then the people will benefit by it later on. So all the money's going into the weapon thing, and they control everything. It's not like they're going to allow you to develop something. They wanted weapons first.
Right, right.
But the Canadians, Wilbur was big into it. And you mentioned that you wanted to know about the channeling thing. So I'll explain how the channeling thing worked. So Wilbur had the woman in, Frances Swan was the big one. And
she was a well-known psychic?
No,
Or
she
clairvoyant?
had actually only started. It was this idea that this may actually, all the players came on the stage exactly when they're supposed to. It started for her a night before Halloween in 1953 is when it started. And she's putting up decorations in a small town, Elliott, and it's the town hall, and they're having a dance, a Halloween dance. And she's putting up the decorations, and this guy comes in who she's never seen before. And it's a small town, so it's like, this guy's from somewhere else. I mean, he's not from this town. And she said he was really gorgeous, and he was a nice-looking guy, and he just said hi to her, or whatever. And then he just sort of left. And she believed that was Alpha. And I corresponded with her. She believed that was Alpha. And she started getting these tones in her ear. And I think it was left ear. She was getting tones in her left ear. And it was really disturbing. And then they would give her this message. They would give her this message. And then she got upset. She says, I can't take this. I mean, stop this noise in my ear and stuff like that. And she learned, like a lot of people do, is you learn through a technique, through a modality, whatever it is, and then eventually you can do it without the modality. You don't need the tarot cards anymore. You don't need anything. And that's what happened, is she could do it, and she would do the automatic writing. So the tone would come in and her hand would start to write or whatever, and she would do this automatic writing stuff. And her neighbor happened to be Admiral Knowles. And Admiral Knowles was a submarine guy in the Navy who was retired, and he discovered her, and he thought he was interested in UFOs, and he knew Wilbert. So he told Wilbert, there's this woman, she's got this contact. And Wilbert said, okay, let's set this thing up. So he took it, and he actually contacted all sorts of people. He contacted the White House. And actually, I think in the book we actually have a document where it gets sent to the Secret Service, where they sent his letter to the Secret Service. So he sent it to the President. He thought the President should know about this woman that's channeling. And she was able to answer questions about, what's the distance between here and Jupiter. And she had like a third-grade education or something.
Was this before he got the memo and the briefing from the guys in the States?
No, the briefing was in September of 1950. This is now 1953. When the sort of the channeling stuff starts, where Frances Swan, and Frances Swan was the big one. And the Canadians would never refer to her, like the metallurgist or Wilbur Smith's son. They would always refer to her as the psychic. They'd never use her name or whatever. They're trying to protect her or whatever. But her name was Frances Swan. So she was getting this stuff. So then Wilbur would go to her, and he would actually travel down there. In fact, Betty Hill was doing the same thing. Betty Hill was traveling that same route when she got abducted. She was coming from Canada when she got abducted.
That's right. That's right.
And so Wilbur would make that route down to Elliott, Maine, to where Betty Hill was living, and he would talk to her. And there's actually a document we have in the book, and I'm not sure whether it's the FBI document we have, and it's all blacked out. But when you know the story well enough, you know what's underneath the lines. And so Wilbur goes down there, and he has, I said, they had this little building where he had these 5 different things, and they were trying to detect flying saucers coming over. And he's going down to Frances Swan, and she's talking to Alpha, and getting these messages, and he's asking questions of Alpha and stuff like that. And then in this FBI document, it basically says that he and his wife were there, and that he had asked Alpha to fly over the observatory. Can you get Alpha to fly over the observatory so we can pick him up? And so it's supposed to happen August the 1st, 1954. In the FBI document, it shows this. August 54.
What was the observatory?
It was built on this Shirley's Bay, this defense property.
Where the UFOs were supposed to land.
Well, no, where they had a building. It had 5 different things. So change in gravity, change in noise,
right.
all these different things, and they would be able to detect if something flew over. So they could tell when a plane.
This was the government thing that they built to
Smith
detect.
built it, and he was given this by the Defense Department. He'd given him this land to put it on,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just a little tiny building with all these machines with paper, and they had to change the paper, and these little things going on the paper. And
So Frances Swan, sorry I interrupted you, asked Alpha to fly by.
that was the idea. They were supposed to happen August the 1st. And then what you find out, when you look at and you put all the pieces together, it didn't happen August 1st, it happened August the 8th. It happened a week later. So we don't know what happened in between, but it had to be the same event. So this radar tech guy says, I was there when it happened. So they were around this thing, and all of a sudden they got bells. And ding ding, the bells are going off, and something's flying over, and they went running outside, and they looked, and it was all overcast. They couldn't see anything. And he said the thing went right off the chart. Right off.
Huge magnetic anomaly.
Something went over, and they said it wasn't a plane, it wasn't anything. And Wilbur was pretty famous. Like every time he would say something, it would be all over newspapers in Canada. And he was actually like the big guy because the Americans weren't talking. So even in the United States, Wilbur Smith was famous. He was this famous guy. He was on the Nightcap board. He was, everybody knew. Fate magazine was writing him up and stuff like that. So he actually went public and he said, "Oh, if there's nothing wrong with the equipment, we just detected the first flying saucer over Ottawa." That was it. Game over. Shut the program down.
They pulled the plug.
They pulled the plug. 2 days later, they pulled the plug, and then they said Wilbur was just doing it part-time. He didn't discover anything. And that's where the story comes from, that Wilbur was doing it part-time, and that nothing ever happened, and all this kind of stuff. But it happened August the 8th, and in the FBI document clearly shows that that's what they were trying to do. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to land him at Suffield, Alberta. He was trying to get him to fly over and stuff like that. And so Alpha became this very famous person. And in '54, there was even, we have in the book the whole story of the 54 satellites, which most people don't know because it just faded off the radar. In '54, there was these 2 objects that were detected. So what was happening was, because they were looking at rockets, they had built long-range radar. So the U.S. Air Force had built this long-range radar to see if there was a Russian missile. They could pick up a Russian missile as it was coming. So they built this long-range radar, and suddenly, boom, they got these 2 big things on the radar. And it gets going. Aviation Week in Space Technology covered it. New York Times covered it. All sorts of people were covering this thing, that they had discovered these 2 satellites, these 2 objects rotating around the Earth. Well, Frances Swan was talking about these 2 giant crafts. One was flown by Alpha, one was Ponar. The same time she's talking about this, and they're tracking this stuff, and it's in the FBI document that she's talking about these L11.
And this is in the book?
It's in the book. And they're talking about this stuff, and even Kehoe, I put out a audio on my podcast where Kehoe talks about it. Major Admiral Kehoe ran Nightcap. He's talking about these satellites, and Wilbert actually said to people, we know where it is. If you see it in the sky, let us know. They were trying to track this thing. And so he was getting this from Frances Swan. And then the government, whoever came up with the story, they said, oh, it's just natural satellites. And then it just died. The story died. The thing is, if it's natural satellites...
Did they correlate where they were in the sky?
No, the government just put out the story that, this isn't satellites. These aren't alien spacecrafts or whatever. They're just satellites. The thing is, if they're satellites, they'll still be there. They're not there.
Right.
I mean, once they get in orbit, they're going to stay in orbit. They're not going to just suddenly fly off again. And so that was a big story in '54, and once they put this story out there, was just natural satellites, the story sort of died, and most people in the UFO community don't know that there was this major story in
Yeah,
1954.
not too many people in the UFO community talk about Wilbur Smith or Project Megaran.
Well, I guess that's part of our problem in Canada, because Canadians never really detail it. There's even other stuff. We have a Destin, I may do a part 2 of the book. There's all sorts of writings. Wilbur Smith wrote all sorts of articles and all this kind of stuff. It's the copyright issue of who controls. He wrote the book. It was called what was the book called? New Science. It's called New Science. I've actually got 2 copies. I could probably sell them for $1,000 a copy. There's only maybe 200 copies printed. Wilbur's wife put it out in 1964, so he died in '62, and he was working on this manuscript. And in the beginning of the manuscript, it says, "Given to me by beings more advanced than we are."
I'll buy $1,000.
So his wife put this thing out, and the last chapter is sort of missing because he died before he finished the last chapter. But it talks about how the universe is created and how they spin. Everything's got to do with spin and all this kind of stuff. And there was actually a group that I heard about in Ohio that was actually researching this book. They had a study group, and they were researching the book, trying to figure out what it meant and stuff like that. And they put it out, and his son said that almost no copies were sold in America. He actually gave me the list. We've got the list of all the people in America who bought it. Most of them were in the Soviet Union and the Scandinavian countries that bought the book. And so there was only a couple of these books put out. So we've got that book, we've got all Smith's writings. None of that stuff is in this book. We're just talking about these background stories. But Smith produced a bunch of material, and his stuff is actually at the University of Ottawa, in Ottawa. And I remember going there, and I was looking at this stuff, and I didn't know how much stuff there was. And there's a funny story, because I was getting stuff, and the woman says, "Oh, you got that file, you can't photocopy everything in the file." I said, "Wow." And she says, "Well, you just can't. That's the rule. You can't photograph everything." And I said, "Well, where's the photocopy?" She says, "Oh, it's down the hall." I go, "Okay." I go down the hall, open the thing, photocopy it all, go back. And I thought I had all of it.
What files were these? You found, like, government
All his files, all his-
Department of Transportation files on Wilbur Smith?
Oh, he had his own private files. In fact, the top secret memo, there's a copy of the top secret memo without the top secret on it. He's got the draft copy in his files.
Wow.
And what happened was, when he was about to die, he said to his wife told me the story. His wife says, Wilbur said, because he had cancer of the lower bowel, he knew he was going to die. And he said, "When I die, they're going to come get the files. You do not give them the files. I don't care what they say, you don't give them the files." And she said, as soon as he died, the Canadians showed up, the Americans showed up, and the Russians showed up. And they all said, "We'd like to have his files for research purposes." And she said, "No, I burned them." And then she'd given them to James, the oldest son. He was hiding the files at his place. And she said, then the break-in started at the house.
Holy shit.
And she said, you could tell, there was nothing taken, but they were looking for the files.
It's like the real-life Canadian
And
X-Files.
so James had them, and then they handed them off to this Arthur Bray, this researcher in Ottawa, and he wrote a couple of books, and he had some of the stuff in his books. Then he put them to the University of Ottawa. Then he gave them back to James, gave authorization for them to go to the University of Ottawa. And so when I went there, and she was giving me this routine about you can't photocopy stuff, I thought I had, and I didn't realize it was like 10,000 pages of material. It was like all sorts of stuff he had. And so then there was another guy there who went there, and he's scanning this stuff. And I said, "Well, they told me I couldn't do it." He said, "Well, they're not giving me anything. They just say I'm not allowed to put it out." I said, "Okay." So he sends me 4 discs. I can actually give
Do you know
you
who
discs.
he was? What was he doing?
He was a researcher, and he's not around anymore, but he just came on the line, and he scanned everything. All the photographs, everything was in there. The whole thing, he took, I don't know, a couple of months to do it, or whatever. It was like 10,000 pages of material. It's 4 discs, 4 DVDs. He sent me of these DVDs. And then he said, "Oh, they said you can't use it." I said, "Tell them I've got them. They want to stop me, sue me." And I never heard anything more. I said, "I got them now. I got all the files." And I just figured, like, hell. And I went to James. I said to James, I said, "What's going on?" They said, "I've got the files now." And I said, "They say that you can't photocopy." He said, "What the heck are they talking about?" That's why I put them there, for research purposes. Like, what are they talking about? And so I knew I had James back if it ever came down to it. And I just tell him I've got all the files. They can go to hell. They can sue me if they want.
Right on.
So I've got all
What were some of the files that really impressed you? Some of the more interesting ones you can think of?
Well, the impressive thing was there was the top secret memo. We have the draft of the top secret memo. Then there was another top secret memo.
The one that explains the bullet points of what the
So there's the one that was, and they would say, "Oh, it didn't really mean anything." It was, he shouldn't, like Slant. We talked to Slant. Slant says, "Oh, he shouldn't have made it classified anyway." He didn't have authorization. And I'm going like, well, how do you classify a document? What do you send it in the mail to some guy and get him to determine what classification is? No, you classify it. You have to classify it before you send the document. So he classified it, and they downgraded it to secret almost immediately. But it didn't get declassified until 1967. They declassified it down to confidential. And then Stanton Friedman was fighting with Arthur Bray in 1978 to get these documents out. They knew that the Smith files were there, and they forced the government to release them. That's when the top secret memo came out. And then one of the documents that came with that was this document we put in the book, was a document from the National Research Council in 1967. I think we call it the Wilson document. And in the document it says, please, attached is the Project Magnet report, do not destroy any files until the subject is cooled off. This 1967 document. So you see this, that they really didn't check it when they should never have released a top secret memo. They just figured there's nothing in this, declassify it, and it all came out. And then suddenly they got this top secret memo, and this other document talks about destroying the documents. And Wilbur Smith's, we have one we put in the book. There's a second top secret memo. So Smith is writing, he says, got the material from Robert Sarbacher, University of Georgia, and I'm looking, he's asking the government for a security clearance to go into the United States to talk to the Americans. Then the other documents that we put in the book that came out of Wilbur Smith's files are the things from the Canadian Embassy. So what happens is all the meetings are going through the Canadian Embassy. So this big research guy, military advisor, Sarbacher, goes to the Canadian Embassy, and they do this interview at the Canadian Embassy. So Wilbur's talking with the third ambassador, or the third secretary at the Canadian Embassy, and they're talking back and forth. And it actually, when you read the document, it actually looks like the Americans, they think there's a crash. The Americans are about to release the fact that they've got a craft, and they're going to release all this stuff. And they're saying, the guy from the embassy said, the ambassador said, nobody outside of you and me are to discuss this, and it's all this confidential stuff where they're waiting for the Americans to make a statement in these documents. And so we got and Smith has these documents that is rated secret, going back and forth between him and the Canadian Embassy. So there's documents like that we put in the book.
Right. Do you think that's what Smith was talking about on his deathbed when he said, don't give him the files?
Yeah, well, he didn't trust the government at the end. He basically didn't trust the government. They tried to grab this gravity control, and he said he could never convince them of anything. He said if you think the government's going to disclose, he said no minister will disclose something that he has no control over. It's not going to happen. So he's basically saying there's going to be no disclosure or whatever. And so when he died, he was just telling his wife that they're going to try to cover this whole thing up. They're going to try to get his files, and that to save
because they would have them anyway. Right.
Well, they didn't have the stuff he had. He had all this stuff, but they wanted to sort of kill the story for good. Get his material, and then his nobody had ever known. Now we've got all the files. We've got these documents and stuff, and we can tell the backstory about what was going on. Because there's all sorts of stuff going on in the background that never was sort of made public. That his wife told, and is sort of backed up in the documents. And then his writings were his writings. But again, it's a story that's it's a Canadian story. And then once '54 came, there was nothing. There was nothing happening in Canada. I think we put did we put the Paul Heller story in the book about the guy at Area 51? Because after '54, nothing happened. So people would ask me, they'd say, well, what's the Canadian government doing now? I go, I haven't got a clue. The whole point is, if you want to cover it up, you do exactly what the Canadian government does, is you just go like, UFOs? How do you spell that?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you after a while you give up. You don't know who to ask. Like, who's going to have this? Who's got control? As the Americans are leaking these documents and there's counter agents coming out and stuff like that. So I really didn't know. But then what happened was, I remember we were in Brampton, and it was Brampton or Toronto. But anyway, so we were there, and what they had done was the citizens' hearing thing. It was an imitation of citizens' hearing. Instead of senators and ex-senators and congressmen, they had reporters. So we were there, Dolan was there, I was there, Friedman was there, and they were asking these questions. And I remember Paul Heller was sitting right beside me. And then they went around and they said, Paul, who knows what's going on in Canada? And he's going, well, it might be the head of the Privy Council, like the Prime Minister's office. And I'm thinking, oh, he's just guessing. It's the old story. Like, nobody knows what's going on in Canada. It's like, they just salute and do whatever the Americans tell them to do.
Department of Transport that did the old, what were they called? The UFO reports that would come in.
Well, there was
The military UFO reports.
Well, there was the military, there was different agencies. So RCMP was filing reports, military, Defense Department, and transport were filing reports, UFO reports, but they were all doing them separately. And then they all ended up at the National Research Council, and those were the ones that were being sent to Chris Rutkowski. That people from those agencies were putting these documents to Chris Rutkowski, which we've got to get to the bottom of. But
And didn't John Greenwald get a bunch of Canadian files?
he was
too?
going after NORAD stuff. No, he tried.
Oh, there was a NORAD stuff.
But
right.
the thing was, when Paul Hellyer, when it went around the first time, and so you could hear he's guessing, and I'm going, it's the whole thing. Nobody knows what's going on here in Canada. And I always said Paul Hellyer didn't know what's going on. Like he got upset because when he gave that speech in '67, then when I put it on my website, I said, he said the story came from the guy who was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police guy, who was the expert in the Department of Defense. He'd come to the Department of Defense, he was the expert on UFOs, but Paul couldn't remember his name. And on my website I'm like, yeah, come on, you can't remember his name, like, come on. And so then Paul came, and I met him at an X conference one time, and you ever met Paul? He's a big, tall guy, he's like 6'7" or whatever, 6'6", and he comes with these documents under his arm. And I still remember, my father used to fly him around. My father didn't like him, but my father used to fly him because he was Minister of Transport as well. And he comes and got these documents under his arm, he says, Mr. Cameron? Well, first he said, I'd like to have breakfast with you. I go, oh, it's pretty cool. I'm gonna ex-Minister of Defense, I'm going to have breakfast with him. He comes out with these documents. Mr. Cameron? This is how the meeting starts. Mr. Cameron, I may be many things, but one of them isn't a liar. And I knew exactly what he was talking about.
I can see him saying that too.
So he puts the documents down. And he says, look, he says, I didn't know what was going on. He shows me his documents. I go, these are defense, these are just sighting reports. This is nothing. I mean, this is not top secret, whatever. These are just, I've seen these documents. They're nothing, just, and then he says, I didn't know what was going on. He says, I was rebuilding the Canadian military. He was putting all of them together, the armed services were together. He said, there was maybe reports coming across, but I didn't have any interest in the subject or whatever. So people always did this thing with Paul Hellyer, and I said, he didn't know, he had no interest in it until he read Corso's book, Day After Roswell. And then the light came on, and suddenly he believed everything. He just
started
running
asking
around.
questions.
And so when we were at this panel, we're going around, and then it came to Paul Hellyer a second time. They're going to ask him another question. And then it goes, oh, I know somebody who would know. And then he blows this story like this. He says, I got a phone call one time from a guy in the Air Force. And he said, oh, there's this guy, he's the head of emergency management in Canada. And he's dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, what's it called, ALS. And he's got something he wants to get off his chest. And he's decided you're the guy he wants to talk to. He doesn't tell him what it was. And so Paul says, yeah, okay, I'll phone the guy up or whatever. And he doesn't phone the guy. So the Air Force guy phones him back up. He says, hey, he's about to go off the cliff. You better phone him up. So he phones up this guy and he says, oh, I got something I got to unload here. He says, I just want to let you know, the UFO thing, it's real. And he says, head of emergency management, I was taken and I was briefed. I was taken to the CIA. I signed my life away, all this stuff. I signed all these documents, and it's for real. And I was taken to Area 51.
Is this in Paul's book?
I don't think Paul ever talked. It's in. We've got the video of him talking about it.
Oh wow!
And he says he went to Area 51. They took him to Area 51. He actually sat inside one of the crafts, and that makes sense. The head of emergency management would know what's going on. He would have a need to know, because if there's a crash and suddenly the stock market melts down, you got to put money in the banks, and they would have a contingency plan for if UFOs exist and what are we going to do.
Right.
And the head of emergency management would be the guy.
Right.
And same in the United States. There was a story that the Mount Weather was where the UFO thing was being hosted. Mount Weather is the bunker where they take the president and the vice president if there's a nuclear attack. It's outside of Washington. And that's a FEMA facility. So FEMA is national emergency in the United States. So our guy would be... Right. So it made sense when Paul said that. I go, wow, the light came on. I was like, yeah, this guy would know. And but other than that, there's really been no, we don't know what it is. It's like, salute, just do what the Americans say. Because all you need, if you're going to keep something secret, is you need one guy in the Canadian Air Force, one guy in the Army, to know what's going on and feed the material up. Everybody else doesn't even know what's going on. And so that's always been the problem with the Canadians, is there's been no interest. And that's what happened with the Smith story, is it fell between the cracks because there was really nobody here that was promoting it. I knew it, and I would, tell stories and stuff, but I had the documents. But it wasn't until we were doing the books I said, we need to get this out. We need to put the books out. So the first book, that we've done in the Canadian government story is to talk the Wilbur Smith story and what was going on in the background, and all these bizarre stories of what was going on with the Ottawa Flying Saucer Club and the metal that they recovered, and what he thought of metal, because all the material was coming from the United States, and this is pretty public. That Wilbur was asked just before he died. You'll see in the book, I think we have, it's a handwritten letter, note from Wilbur Smith back to a guy in Ohio. Like the Ohio were big on the Ottawa group. They would exchange and they'd go back and forth, whatever. And they were running this study group on the book, trying to figure out the book meant. And one of the guys there, we actually have an audio tape, which we will put up on the podcast, where one of the guys comes just before Wilbur dies. He's up there about 6 months before, and of course Wilbur now is unloading. And he says Wilbur told him that there was people coming with metal all the time, and there would be guys coming to his house with suitcases chained to their wrist. And Wilbur Smith's son talks about this, and I've actually got his son on tape. I phoned him up and asked him this thing. I said, there's a story told by, they had what was called the Inner Circle group. So there was Wilbur Smith, and then there was these inner circles. He had one guy from the Air Force, one guy from the Navy. He had this metallurgist guy that lived in Morden. He had these guys, and they all were this secret group, and they didn't talk what they were doing and this sort of stuff. And so now I've lost my train of thought here.
Talking about the government guys who would come to visit.
Yeah, so he's got the metal material, and they had a piece that they got off out of the St. Lawrence, and the guy from Ohio came up and he said that Wilbur told him that he was getting all this metal. These guys were coming to see him, and his son. When I interviewed his son, I asked that Buchanan, who was one of these inner circle guys, who basically when I contacted him, he said, "Look, this is an old story. You're beating a dead horse. Leave it alone. It's not going anywhere." He was dying of cancer. He was just really upset about this whole thing. So he said, "Forget it. I don't want to talk to you. And you're just pushing the issue. It's not going anywhere." And he had told the story that Wilbur had seen a craft and bodies. And then I'm not sure if we got in the book, but there's a story that was told. Sherman, that we went to see some files in Arkansas, and the guy that had those files. There was a one of the files in there that talked about a guy in the United States who said that the guy from the Aztec story, they said these two guys hoaxed the thing. And the one guy had made this statement that Wilbur had given him access to the bodies, and this key, because I mean, why would a Canadian have access to the bodies? And then I hear the story that James Smith had said, yeah, his father had seen the bodies. So I said to James, I phoned him. I said, so Buchanan in Edmonton is telling this story that Wilbur was showing a craft outside of Washington, D.C.? Yeah, that's true. I said, it's true? He said, yeah, my dad told me about that before he died. He said, when my dad was dying and he knew there wasn't anything more, he confirmed to me. I asked him, he said, yeah. I was taken and shown the craft, and I saw the bodies. And of course, what's the first question you ask about the bodies? Were they grays? He said, no, they weren't grays. He said, they looked just like us, but they were smaller people. That's what I recall. He said, not quote me on that, but he said that's basically what it was. That he was taken to a craft outside of Washington. He was shown the craft and the body. So it might have been Andrews Air Force Base. We don't really know, because there's never been any other reports outside of Washington. And so Wilbur had this very high level thing, and he had the metal. So
So you said that he did something in the St. Lawrence, and he was getting.
Yeah, they had a bunch of stuff. His son said that also there was blue military cars coming to the house all the time from the United States, and they would send metal fragments from the United States to Wilbur, to this metallurgist guy that I talked to, and he was doing the analysis. So I asked the metallurgist guy, I said, so how much metal did you actually analyze? He said, tons of it. Wow. And at one point he said, the Roswell thing, I think we analyzed that thing. He was talking about the metal, the memory metal stuff. He said, I think we analyzed that stuff. And so they had this thing where there was a giant explosion over the St. Lawrence, and they found these 3 huge pieces of metal on the side of the St. Lawrence River. And one was like 3,000 pounds or something, one was 2,000 pounds or whatever. And of course they said, well, it was this foundry down the thing, and it was this slag or whatever. But it just suddenly appeared there. And this is this whole idea behind UFO crashes. Are UFO crashes being shot down? Are they riding into lightning? Or are, as Tyler D says, are they being gifted? Because that's what I said to Jacques Vallée. If you saw my Jacques Vallée interview, I said, it doesn't make any sense, Jacques. They come across the galaxy, they fly all the way here, and then they start crashing, and little pieces are falling off these flying saucers, and this doesn't make any sense. It looks like they're dropping this stuff. And then Jacques says, well, the gifting idea, I think I came up with that idea. and so this is the idea that they may have dropped these pieces. So Wilbert talks about this. He talks about the metallurgist guy there. You have this diamond tooth saw or something, and they're trying to cut it, and sparks are flying and stuff like this. So we put a little bit of that in the book about this metal material. Wilbur handled a lot of metal. He was a pretty famous guy. That's what people don't realize, that he was a main guy in the United States and Canada, and he just was very open about what was going on. He would talk about confidentiality, and the one guy asked him, because the one piece he got was and we talk about it in the book. We have a chapter in the book called the 52 piece. So the 52 piece is the story about, they claim they shot a piece, there's an orb flying over Washington, D.C., and they scramble these jets, and they shoot at it, and they knock a piece off this craft. And that's how Wilbur describes that, or everybody describes it, but that's how you describe it in the 1950s. We were told they shot it off. And it falls into the property of some CIA guy. And this CIA guy actually writes a book about this, and they send the material, this piece, to Canada, and in the book we actually have a drawing. Admiral Knowles, who had lived next to Francis Swan, actually drew this thing. He saw the piece, and he draws what this piece looked like, and they all believed it came off a 2-foot orb piece. And that Wilbur handled this thing, and then he sent it back. So at the very end of his life, there's a handwritten document we put in there where Wilbur is answering some guy from Ohio, and the guy's saying, what about this piece? You sent it back. Who did you send it back to? Did you send it back to the CIA? And Wilbur is answering, he said, no, I sent it back. No, it went higher than the CIA. That identity of that group you'll have to figure out for yourself. And he handwrites it because he can no longer type. He's dying. He's very disabled at that time. He writes it in a handwritten thing. So there's all this stuff about the metal, and Wilbur was very involved
I didn't know that.
all
That's
this
really
metal
neat.
stuff that was coming from the United States that were shared. And the other thing he told, I'm pretty sure we mentioned in the book, there was a woman that was there was a small group, and we were trying to talk to all the people that were still alive in this group that were around Wilbur Smith. And one was Helford Watkins. Her husband was the Air Force guy in this, what you call the inner circle. And she was the wife, but she was the editor of the Ottawa Flying Saucer Club newsletter, which I've got all the copies of the newsletter from all the ones they put out. And she said Wilbur had told her that there was a room inside the Pentagon that had hardware, that had like a museum of UFO hardware. So you see it moves from the Pentagon, where it's just got a little bit in the early 1950s, they've got pieces and stuff like that, and then it moves to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then it moves to Area 51, then when Area 51 gets exposed, then the supposed story, Stephen Greer says they moved it to Ohio where the Mormons can keep their mouth shut, and they're running it out of Utah, or the other one is it's in the South Pacific on an island now that they moved all the material, so they got this UFO material that that's made the ship, but it started according to Helford Watkins, and this is a letter from the 1970s where she said Wilbur told her that they had a museum of UFO hardware, a room inside the Pentagon where people could go look at this stuff. It's a wild story, eh?
It is a wild
To think
story.
that happened in Canada.
Details, yeah, and the Wilbur Smith connection is amazing. Right on, Grant. This has been a great chat. Is there anything else you want to add? Maybe Project Magnet? Did we talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's two different projects. One was Project Magnet, which was the Wilbur Smith project.
And what was
Project Second Story was the other one, which was the defense one. But the second one, the defense one, only had about 7 meetings, I think. And if you read the notes of the meeting, it was basically Wilbur Smith was talking, and all the other guys were just sitting there. And but he was powerful enough; he could drag all these high-level military people in, and guys from the the generals and stuff like that, and get these guys involved. But in the end, he basically said that they weren't buying his goods. They just they wrote him off as a crazy guy. And
do you know why they called it Project Magnet and what else was going on in that project?
His idea, he was working on gravitational stuff, so he believed the proposal to the Department of Transport was the Earth is like a giant magnet. It's like, and they're using the magnetic fields of the Earth for propulsion. And that if we can figure this out, it's the old propulsion thing. If we figure this out, we can get free energy here, and that's what he believed. So that's why he called it Project Magnet. And that was the proposal to get money to do this research. He believed there was a magnetic sink. They were creating this magnetic sink.
Didn't he do some magnetic anomaly studies on Lake Ontario?
Well, he was doing a lot of stuff. There was actually a Project Magnet in the United States. They were flying around these planes in the United States, measuring the magnetic fields of all around the United States. So there was all these links, but it was how much material we could get. He was in charge of ionospheric stuff, so he was in charge of where they were bouncing radio signals off the ionosphere, and he was running all the different ionospheric stations. So he was involved in the 1957 was the year of the, it was a major year where they had all these scientific exploration from all around the world and stuff like that. He was involved in a lot of stuff, and yet his files, I haven't even read through his files. I've got his files, but it's like my Stanton Friedman files. I got 6,000 pages of Stanton Friedman files, and they're very hard to read through because nothing's in order. And I would say to people, they'd say, oh, what about in the Friedman? You want to see the Friedman files? I can just, one click of a mouse, it's on my OneDrive. And then I would say to people, if you see anything interesting, tell me. Nobody's ever written me back about, oh, I saw this document, because you help me read the documents, because 6,000 pages,
So many,
I've only read maybe 10% of the Stanton Friedman stuff, and the Wilbert Smith is the same thing. I've only read maybe not even 10% of the files.
Wow,
I've
really?
got 4 discs of these files of all these.
Looks like we got some work to do.
And that's the thing, is you can put this kind of stuff out where you put it on the record, so instead of me having this stuff on my computer and Desta's got it, I mean, put it out so that maybe someone can read it. Most people won't read it, but at least it's there for everybody to look at. So that's why I said, like, you have all these writings. Wilbur Smith wrote all sorts of articles. He wrote a book and stuff like that, which there's only 200 copies, and people have heard about it and stuff like that. And to get somebody who may look at it, I know that's why NIDS, these people in NIDS were contacting me, because they were into everything NIDS, and they were contacting me because they wanted to know about Wilbur Smith and the propulsion thing. They wanted to know what had I got, and then I got a request through a second party. Jacques Vallée wanted the medals, because Jacques Vallée's in the medal. Can I see the medal stuff? And then so I sent all the medal files from the Smith files over, and then I just got this second-hand thing. Jacques says, thank you. And so at least somebody's reading it.
Well, that's good, that's good. I mean, man, not many people, I think it's really important you did this, It's a big part of Canadian history.
Yeah,
UFO
but I'm sort of a
history.
collector. I used to collect matchbook covers. I've still got my collection of 17,000 matchbook covers. Some of them are almost 100 years old. And
Wow.
so to me, it's always like a game. It's like,
see
when
if
you're
you
doing
can get
matchbook
all
covers, it's like you want to get all the Holiday Inns. I've got 3,000 Holiday Inns of all these different Holiday Inns matchbook covers. And it's like a game. So it's
Right.
to me, it's like you're playing a chess game. And so you're just watching the board, and it's like, why didn't they move that piece? If the guy knows what he's doing it for a reason.
Yeah,
And to me, it's a game. It's like trying to figure it out, and you're trying to get all the material. So if you hear the Stanton Friedman files, it costs some money. I go, yeah, I'm going to go check this out. I want to go see. And the first thing I do when I go to the Friedman files is I knew about the Cuban case. So I go, I file and get the thing, and they've got the Cuban file. First thing I go in there, I said, what box you want first? The one with the Cuban in it. And I go and look, and this is a story about the Cubans scramble these jets. And they go after the UFO, and then the wingman says, he's gone, the plane's gone.
The plane just vaporizes.
As they lock on to take it down and stuff. And that interests me when you're in an archives. Even Desta's we've gone a couple. In fact, Desta made a big discovery we were in Tucson. We were looking at the files, and they have all these rules, when you're in an archives, you can't, they don't want you pulling more than one file at a time because you're going to get it all mixed, and don't take the stuff out of the file. So Desta's got everything spread all out there. And she had found, we were talking about metals, about these metals that get dropped. So what Desta found was a metal, it looks like a spike. I don't know if you've ever seen the photograph.
Yeah, another one, yeah.
With the bubbles on the top.
Yeah.
And it's got the copper core on the inside. And this is from 1939. The guy's a farmer, and he sees this thing coming out of the sky like a meteorite coming down. It goes,
Wow.
digs into the
That
garden.
was before satellites.
1939,
right?
yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
And he waits for the thing, and the metal is always hot. So he waits, and he gets a knife, and he pulls this thing out, and then he sends it to his daughter. His daughter sees it, and she's in Tucson. And then NASA has a lab there, because it's 1967, they're putting the man on the moon or whatever. So she's got this weird looking thing, spike that came out of the sky, and she takes it there, and it's in this file, and Desta finds it in the file, because she's working on some files I'm working on, and you're trying to get it through as many files. And it becomes like a search, you're trying to, or we were in Arkansas, remember we were in Arkansas, and I'm sitting there, and you find these discoveries, like, I don't know if you follow, I got involved because of Edgar Casey. So Edgar Casey's the American big prophet,
Right.
the sleeping prophet. And so we're sitting there and we're looking at this, and this guy that I can't remember the guy's name, we were researching. Sherman, yeah, he has this research, he's got writing.
Harold
Sherman. He doesn't believe in reincarnation, but he's interacting with Casey. And here's actual letters with Casey's signature on it. I'm going, holy shit!
Wow.
I was ready to go to the archives. I said, you better lock this thing up, man.
Where did you find those? Where
It
was
was
that?
in an archive. So when you go to these archives, it's like a gold rush. So I
Right.
went to see like the archives of the guy who wrote the Scully, Frank Scully, who wrote the Aztec book, the first crash saucer book. It's at the University of Wyoming. So I'd always go to I'd go to the West Coast, and you'd be going right through Laramie, Wyoming. Go, hey, let's go look at the Sherman files. And you go through and you're looking through this stuff, and you're the first guy to touch those documents since the guy touched them.
Wow.
And the guy's dead, and these archivists, they don't remember, they stick this stuff in, and you're looking for the gold mine. You're going like, maybe he wrote to somebody, and there was one we actually had in there, in the Scully file, to show you how this works. So we're in the Scully files, and the same guy who discovered Dr. Arawakar was this Bill Steinman out of California. So Scully lived in Los Angeles. He dies, and then my friend goes to his wife and says, "Oh, can I see his files? Can I go through his files?" And she said, "I'm sending him to the University of Wyoming, where he went to school, and you've got 24 hours." And so he goes through this, and he finds this letter from 1952, a handwritten letter from a woman out of New York to Frank Scully, and said, "Oh, I liked your book here, and I just got to tell you this story." She says, and the story, if you know the story of the live alien, she says, "Oh, we were traveling on the west through Nevada, and we had a flat tire or something, and we were there, and this very young, nice guy from," I think she said the FBI, I can't remember, it's in the letter, from the FBI came along, and he was very helpful. He wore a suit, and he helped us get our car going and stuff like that. And then he got involved with the daughter. He took a shine to my daughter. And he told his daughter that he had worked, and they had a live alien in New Mexico, and that the alien couldn't talk, and that they had put a thing in the alien's throat to help the alien talk. Well, that story comes up in the alien thing, and I'm going like, this is the same, and it's like a handwritten letter from 1952, and then you're going,
Wow.
They may have actually had an alien that couldn't talk, and they put a voice thing inside the throat. So it's those kind of things you're looking for when you know Stanton, like Stanton's got, there was 15 pallets of documents. And then when I heard
15 pallets of documents.
yeah, there's
Shit.
like a million, this whole basement in this garage, and everything was
Wow.
stacked high to the ceiling of documents. It was full. And so you look at it, and then when they told me when I was leaving, they said, "Oh, they were showing me the palette of the documents, and every videotape he'd done, like tapes from 1970 interviews on these big tapes, and stuff like that." And then she said, "Oh, and we got a lot of audio tapes. He taped all his phone calls." I went, "He what? Hey, what?"
He taped all his phone calls. Wow.
So then I went back. I was going to go there a couple months ago, and I said, "Have you got?" Because they have an audio person who does all the videos and all the audios. And I said, "Have they got those audios done yet?" And
So
she said, "I'll have to talk."
There's someone that manages all the files there?
Yeah, and these archivists, because they're handling the files, because Stanton, they didn't really want the Stanton files there. Because it was like, he's an American. So why would Fredericton pay all this money to
Right.
file his files? But he was so famous in Fredericton that they talked the archives, which isn't into UFOs, it's not into anybody's files. It's got land title stuff and deaths, births, all this kind of stuff. And suddenly they got this collection, it's got 4 people, and they figure it's like 4 years, 4 full-time people working on this thing, filing these files.
Wow.
And 1 page at a time, because Stan didn't have any file drawers. Everything was, she went in, like, she said stuff was stuck to the ceiling, all these papers, stacked to the ceiling. She said, Stan, why didn't you file this stuff? And he said, "I have a secretary, no, I don't have a secretary." And so they have to go through this stuff 1 page at a time. And when I was there, she was getting me to help her, what to do. And she said, "I got all these stuff, like all these notes, like I do, the same thing. You got these little notes, a piece of paper, or whatever." And she's got all these notes. "What should I do with them?" I said, "Well, don't throw them out. Just stick them in a box." And so she has this box with just these pieces of paper with somebody's phone number on it or something like that. I said, "You never know where it'll come down." And they were sitting there. They didn't even know who people were. I said, "Okay, so you got to have Phil Klass, You ever file for full class? Oh, we know him already. We know him.
Yeah.
We've seen all that stuff. And so they're trying to figure out, because they don't know UFOs, they don't know researchers, they don't know anything. And I said, MJ-12, you got to get all the MJ-12. And then I heard, the other thing that I heard when I left, they said, oh, we got his computer. And his computer crashed just before he died. And we got a guy that's going to pull the files off the computer. So when I was going to go last time, I said, hey, you got a computer, you got the files in? Because that'll help all the TTSA stuff, you may have Elizondo correspondence, you may have, who knows what's on the, and that's all going to be sort of sorted. You can actually just grab it off the.
I got to talk to Stan a few years ago, maybe a year before he passed, and I asked him about TTSA, and pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah, so he would have some stuff on there. And that's the thing, nobody's seen it. So I'm going to be the first one there, unless somebody else beats me there. And so that's the game is to me. It's like, oh my God, I wonder what's going to be find, you know? Like, I'm going to have some big thing. And then you put it out and everyone goes, yeah, whatever, they don't even care.
That's awesome. Well, Grant, it's amazing that you do this hard work, man. You dedicate so much time and energy.
I have no life.
Yeah, I'm envious. Hopefully someday when I have more time, I'm going to get around to doing it. Thanks, Grant.
Okay,
Appreciate it. Cheers.